Human civilization didn't start with invention, it started with inheritance. One of the oldest administrative records we've ever recovered describes kings ruling for lengths of time that shouldn't be biologically possible in cities that were already considered sacred under an authority that didn't originate on Earth. And then in one cold, unemotional line, it records the end of that entire world. Then the flood swept over. Here's the thought that flips the usual story on its head. What if the first kings of Sumer didn't rule over the beginning of civilization, but over its final phase? That's not just a wild idea. It's exactly how one of humanity's oldest record-keeping cultures chose to frame it, because the text doesn't describe kingship being invented, it describes kingship arriving. It talks about rulers holding authority in cities that already had cosmic meaning, governing an order they inherited rather than created, and ruling not for decades, but for epochs. These kings maintained control across a world we barely recognize, until everything ended, not gradually, and not through conquest, but through water, catastrophe, and what ancient memory calls the Great Flood. The standard timeline taught in school is clean and comforting. Around 3500 BC, writing appears in Mesopotamia, temples grow into cities, and formal government begins. But what if that birth was actually a rebuild? And the evidence for that isn't hidden away in secret vaults, but has been sitting in museums for over a century, carved into baked clay. The artifact at the center of this is called the Sumerian King List, and it doesn't politely suggest civilization started earlier. It states, in the same boring tone used for taxes and inventory, that before a catastrophic flood reset the world kingship already existed in structured form for a span so huge, it sounds like fantasy, 241, 200 years. If you're into historical mysteries that mess with the official timeline, go ahead and hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. And just so we're clear, the visuals in this video are here to add context, but the real evidence is in the clay tablets, the excavated cities, and the ancient texts that refuse to cleanly separate myth from history. If you want, close your eyes and just listen, because this story is going to move like a documentary, but the punchline keeps landing like a plot twist. Let's jump back to 1922. In the dusty ruins of ancient Larsa, in what's now southern Iraq, a British archaeological expedition, led by Herbert Weld Blundell, was digging through layers of Sumerian debris, broken pottery, crumbling mud brick, the everyday leftovers of a civilization that's been dead for thousands of years. And in that dirt, they found something that looked almost unimpressive at first. A four-sided clay prism about the size of a closed fist, covered edge to edge, in cuneiform, the wedge-shaped writing system of the earliest literate culture on Earth. When scholars started translating it, they expected the usual stuff, that excavations tend to produce: temple hymns, trade receipts, building dedications, and administrative paperwork, the ancient equivalent of spreadsheets. Instead, they got a text that didn't fit neatly into any box. It was a list organized sequential and precise recording rulers, their capital cities, and the exact length of each reign, like a legitimacy ledger or a court register. And what shocked everyone wasn't that it listed kings, because that's normal. It was the way it listed them, not as myth, not as poetry, not as allegory, but as if it was simply stating facts. The opening line is the kind of sentence that sounds simple until you realize what it's actually claiming. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was an eridu, descended, not invented, not negotiated, not seized through war, not slowly developed out of councils and clans, but descended as if authority itself dropped into human society from somewhere outside it. Then the list names the first ruler Alulim, and it assigns him a reign of 800 years. The next king Alalgar rules 36,000 years. The third, Enmenluana, rules 43,200 years. And it keeps going like that, king after king, city after city. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak Sipar, Shurupak, 5 capitals, 8 rulers, each one assigned a reign length that bulldozes the very idea of human mortality. When the ancient scribe totals it up, it's not vague or approximate, it's precise. 8 kings ruled for a combined 200 years. And then comes that line, again, the one that reads like the end of a chapter in a spreadsheet. Then the flood swept over. No drama, no explanation, no moral lesson, just a statement that the entire system got wiped out. From a modern perspective, those numbers feel like pure fantasy, because nobody lives 28,000 years and nobody rules for 36,000. So the immediate academic reaction was to dismiss the pre-flood section as mythology, legendary founder, king's symbolic figures, or exaggerated storytelling meant to make the past feel bigger than life. And that explanation sounds reasonable, right up until you notice the detail that makes this whole thing impossible to shrug off. Because after that floodline, the text doesn't end. It keeps going, listing new kings, new dynasties, new cities, and suddenly the reign lengths change hundreds of years at first, then 125, then 90, then down into numbers that look like real human lifespans. In other words, the document shifts from the impossible into the plausible without changing tone format or attitude. And even more awkward, the later parts of the list include rulers who are historically confirmed kings, whose cities have been excavated, whose artifacts exist, whose names appear in multiple independent sources. The most famous example is Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, the same Gilgamesh whose epic is one of the oldest surviving works of literature on Earth, and whose massive city walls have been physically unearthed by archaeologists. Gilgamesh appears in the same document, written in the same matter-of-fact style, as the 8 impossible kings who came before the flood. So now there's a problem if the post-flood section is treated as legitimate history, and it is then, what's the logical basis for confidently declaring the pre-flood section just myth when it's presented as one continuous record by the same scribal tradition? The Sumerian King List doesn't pause to tell you, okay, from here on out, this becomes metaphor. It doesn't signal a genre shift. It doesn't draw a line between divine legend and human history. It records kings who ruled for 200 years, and kings who ruled for 43 years, with the exact same administrative voice, as if to the people preserving this text. It was all one uninterrupted timeline, broken only by catastrophe. And that leaves an uncomfortable question sitting in the middle of the table. What if the King List isn't mythology at all? What if it's memory encoded in a way we don't understand yet, but preserved as real history by the people closest to it? If the pre-flood reigns were just random exaggerations, it would be easier to shrug them off and move on. But the numbers in the Sumerian King List don't feel random at all. They feel engineered. They follow patterns tied to the Sumerian sexagesimal system, a base 60 way of calculating time that shows up everywhere in Mesopotamian math and record keeping. And once that clicks, the impossible reigns start looking less like a fairy tale and more like a structured data set. One of the biggest formal units of time in that system was the SAR, which equals 3,600 years. Now watch what happens when you translate those reigns into that unit. Alulim's 800 years becomes exactly 8 SAR. Alalgar's 36,000 becomes 10 SAR. Enmenluana's 200 becomes 12 SAR. That's not the vibe of a storyteller tossing out huge numbers just to impress an audience. That's calculation symmetry and precision, the kind of thing scribes do when they're recording a system they believe has order. So, at this point, two major interpretations show up, and both are unsettling in completely different ways. The first is the symbolic time explanation. The numbers represent eras, dynasties, or cycles, and the names are basically placeholders for long stretches of influence. But if that's the case, why does the list present these as the reigns of specific named individuals, each tied to specific cities in the same format used to track real succession? Why keep the administrative structure if the content is only metaphor? The second interpretation is the one people hesitate to say out loud. Maybe these rulers weren't human in the way modern readers assume. The text itself sets that tone from the first line by saying kingship descended from heaven, which frames authority as something delivered from outside the human sphere rather than built from inside it. In that worldview, political power isn't an invention or an evolution, it's an installation. And once that idea is on the table, it changes how those reign lengths get interpreted, because suddenly the question becomes less about human lifespans and more about what kind of beings the text is actually describing. This is where the term Anunnaki enters the conversation, because it appears throughout Sumerian religious material as beings associated with coming from heaven to earth and acting as participants in human affairs, teachers, judges, rulers, and administrators within a larger order. They're often translated as divine, but the way they function in the texts doesn't always match the later, more abstract idea of distant gods. They read more like authorities inside a system, a hierarchy with jobs, domains, and rules. And here's another reason the King List can't be brushed aside. As a single weird artifact, it isn't alone. Archaeologists have recovered at least 16 different copies or fragments of the list from multiple Mesopotamian cities, Nippur, Kish, Isin, and others preserving the same core outline: 8 kings, enormous reigns, sacred cities, then the flood, then mortal dynasties. That matters because it means this wasn't just a local legend or one scribe's creative writing project. It was accepted, copied, and preserved as foundational history by the civilization that invented writing large-scale administration and urban planning. So now the real question isn't just who were these kings? The bigger question is what kind of world is the text describing? Because if the King List is preserving even a distorted memory of something real, then the era before the flood wasn't a primitive beginning. It was a sustained order. A world where cities already existed, where authority was already structured, where sacred geography was already mapped, and where civilization wasn't climbing upward for the first time, so much as maintaining itself until a catastrophe hit reset. To get a grip on that, it helps to stop thinking in the usual slow progress storyline. Hunter-gatherers settle down, villages grow, writing is invented, then cities appear, then governments form. The King List suggests something almost reversed. Kingship arrives into a world that's already organized. And the object that carried this message, the Weld-Blundell prism, makes it even stranger, because it's not a poem, not a mythic epic, not a temple hymn. It's a succession record, a chronological inventory of power, moving through time and space, written with the same relentless structure, whether the reign is 30 years or 30,000. Then it drops that same chilling line again. Then the flood swept over. No explanation, no dramatic flourish, just the statement that something catastrophic erased the whole system. And immediately after, the list resumes with shorter reigns, more human-scale dynasties, and eventually historically verifiable names. As if the flood didn't just destroy cities, but altered the nature of the world those cities existed in. That pushes the investigation into the environment itself. The pre-flood era described by the list lines up roughly with a real window of Earth's history the transition from the late Ice Age into the early Holocene, a planet warming but still in flux. Southern Mesopotamia, in that period, likely looked nothing like the arid landscape people picture today, because geological cores from the region show silt layers, organic matter, and freshwater deposits extending far inland from the current Persian Gulf coastline. In other words, what's desert now used to be a vast wetland, marshes, reed beds, slow-moving channels, and predictable seasonal flooding that fertilize the land instead of annihilating it. That kind of landscape changes everything about stability. In a world of abundant water, fish reeds, migrating birds, and reliable seasonal patterns, communities aren't forced into constant crisis mode. And if communities aren't constantly fighting scarcity, then long-term continuity becomes easier. Social structures can persist, and institutions can stay intact for long stretches without being smashed by desperation and collapse. The environment itself can become the silent partner that allows a system like kingship to endure. But the story doesn't stay stable forever. The later world, the post-flood world, looks more chaotic. Shorter rains, rapid turnover cities, rising and falling on faster timelines. And that pattern mirrors environmental shifts that follow later, when sea levels rise more aggressively, coastlines change, and river systems shift, pushing the region toward the harsher conditions associated with the historical Bronze Age. Whether the flood in the King List reflects a single cataclysmic event, or a long collapse compressed into one narrative sentence, the memory being preserved is the same. A stable world ended, and a different world began. Now bring that back to the cities, the text names starting with Eridu. Excavations at Eridu uncovered successive temples, rebuilt again and again, on the exact same sacred footprint, with a continuity so strong it's hard to explain using the normal picture of prehistoric flexibility. Deep in its layers, the earliest structures aren't learning experiments that slowly evolve into formal sacred architecture. They're already temples, already intentional, already oriented in a consistent way. Instead of showing a clean progression from primitive shelter to monumental planning, Eridu appears already functioning as a sacred center. And Eridu isn't the only piece that feels like that. Other early sites tied to this world show signs of specialized knowledge, like Bad Tibira with early metalworking traditions. And it creates the impression that Mesopotamian urbanism shows up in the record already wearing its city identity. That's why the King List feels so provocative. It matches the eerie sense that some early cities weren't invented step by step, so much as implemented as parts of a system. Which brings the story back to a theme the King List keeps hinting at. The cities weren't just population centers, they were nodes in a symbolic geography, each tied to a cosmic role. Eridu connects to wisdom and creation, Bad Tibira to metallurgy and transformation, Sippar to solar justice and timekeeping, and Shuruppak to transition, the threshold point right before the flood narrative takes over. Taken together, that reads less like random successful settlements and more like a deliberately structured network where place itself carries meaning. And if that's true, then the opening line hits even harder. Kingship didn't rise upward out of human society. It descended into an already meaningful map of the world. The king isn't portrayed as a conqueror building legitimacy through force, but as the occupant of an office, because the institution is the constant and the individuals are temporary. In that model, authority flows downward, and challenging it isn't just politics, it's rebellion against the structure of reality as that culture understood it. Sumerian tradition preserves this idea in the concept of me often described as divine powers or civilizational norms, a kind of packaged set of principles that governs how the world is supposed to function. And once me enters the story, the King List stops looking like a weird outlier and starts looking like one chapter from a much larger operating system. So let's talk about that concept. The Sumerians kept circling back to me. It's one of those words that gets translated a dozen different ways because there isn't a perfect modern equivalent, but in the Sumerian worldview, me are basically the operating codes of civilization, not just laws in the human sense, and not just religious commandments either, more like the packaged principles that define how reality is supposed to function: kingship, priesthood, writing, craftsmanship, justice, ritual, timing, social roles, and the invisible rules that make a complex society hold together. And here's why that matters for the King List. Because if civilization is built on preset norms that are received, preserved, and maintained, then kingship isn't a human invention that evolves slowly out of village politics. Kingship becomes one module inside a larger system, like one component in a machine that was already designed. The king isn't the source of the system. The king is the caretaker of the system. That's also why the Sumerian idea of authority feels so alien to modern minds. Today, even if people disagree about politics, there's still an underlying assumption that systems are negotiable, laws can be rewritten, institutions can be reformed, authority can be challenged, and legitimacy has to be argued for. But in the world the King List describes, legitimacy doesn't come from argument. It comes from alignment. The king's authority isn't personal charisma, and it isn't just military control, it's positional, like holding an office that exists independently of the person sitting in it. That matches something else you see in how the King List is written. It doesn't frame the first rulers as founders who build a state from nothing. It frames them like occupants of a seat that was already there, in cities that already had meaning in an order that already existed. And if the audience hearing this list believed that kingship descended from heaven, then the office of kingship wasn't just political, it was cosmic. Think about what that does psychologically. If authority is seen as flowing down from a higher realm, then rebellion isn't just dissent. It's stepping outside the structure that keeps the world stable. And that lines up with something else that's weirdly absent. In early Sumerian thinking, you don't get heroic freedom narratives where humans defy the gods and win. When defiance happens, it tends to end badly, because the whole story logic is built around preserving order, not breaking it. And that's the paradox. To modern ears, divinely instituted kingship sounds like propaganda, like something rulers say to justify power they grabbed. But the King List doesn't sound like propaganda, because it doesn't read like someone selling you a story. It reads like someone filing a report. Dry, sequential, administrative, the same tone, whether a reign lasts decades or tens of thousands of years. If kingship is one of the civilizational norms that are handed down, then the earliest kings may have been seen less as tyrants and more as technicians of order. Their job wasn't to innovate non-stop. It was to keep the system running, to make sure the rituals happened when they were supposed to happen. The sacred spaces stayed aligned, the legal order stayed legible, and the continuity didn't break. In that kind of world, stability becomes the highest value. Continuity becomes sacred. Now look back at the cities again with that lens. Eridu isn't just a place people lived. It's a node of wisdom and creation. A location where knowledge and order are anchored to the earth. Bad Tabira isn't just a town. It's transformation metal craft, the ability to reshape raw matter into tools, weapons, and civilization itself. Sippar isn't just a settlement. It's timekeeping and justice tracking. The heavens aligning law with cosmic order. And Shuruppak sits there like a doorway, transition, preparation, the place where the old world reaches the edge. When a culture treats geography like that, cities become more than infrastructure. They become stations in a network, physical anchors for abstract functions. And that's why the rebuilding pattern at sites like Eridu is so eerie, because it suggests the sacred footprint wasn't negotiable. People didn't just rebuild because it was convenient. They rebuilt because that exact location mattered, that exact orientation mattered, and whatever it connected to had to stay connected. So, if this really was an inherited system, an installed order, then the King List is basically telling you that the earliest humans didn't see themselves as inventors of civilization. They saw themselves as custodians, people maintaining a framework that was already in place, whether they fully understood its origin or not. And that leads straight into the most loaded phrase in the entire document: kingship descended from heaven. Because once you accept that the text is presenting this as a matter-of-fact claim, you have to ask what heaven actually means in this context. Is it purely spiritual language, like a poetic way of saying the gods approved? Or is it pointing to something more literal, something that to the Sumerians was simply part of how reality worked? Power, arriving from above knowledge, arriving from above order, arriving from above. Here's the thing, whether someone reads this through a mainstream historical lens or a more radical one, the story still forces the same question. If the Sumerians believed civilization's key components were received, not invented, then received from whom? And how did that belief become so embedded that it shaped everything from kingship to law to temple design? Because it's not just the King List. The broader Sumerian worldview treats writing as something given, not discovered. It treats law as something revealed, not debated into existence. It treats sacred measurement and ritual timing as if they're aligning human life to an external structure, like society is being tuned to match a frequency that already exists. And this is where the story gets even stranger, because a system like that can persist for a long time if the environment stays stable. The wetlands, the abundance, the predictable cycles, those conditions could support continuity not just biologically, but institutionally. But then the King List drops the hard reset. Then the flood swept over. That single sentence doesn't just mark a disaster. It marks a break in inheritance. If civilization began with inheritance, then the flood is the moment inheritance gets severed, when whatever was being passed down is interrupted, scrambled, reduced, rebuilt from fragments. And that would explain why the post-flood world in the text feels smaller, shorter, reigns faster, dynastic turnover, and a system that still exists but doesn't carry the same impossible timescale. So when people ask, do you really think anyone ruled for 800 years, they might be asking the wrong question. The better question could be, what is the text trying to preserve about that era that the scribes thought was worth recording with bureaucratic precision? Because even if those numbers are symbolic, the structure of the record is telling you that the Sumerians believed the world before the flood had continuity, an unbroken order that lasted longer than anything we can comfortably fit into our timeline. And if that's true, then the flood isn't just a mythic story about water. It's the border between two kinds of humanity, one that lives inside an inherited system and one that has to rebuild after the system collapses. One that remembers the installed order and one that turns that memory into legend, because the original context is gone. In the next part, the focus shifts to the big question that hangs over everything. If kingship really descended, what does that imply about the source of the system, about the beings, the hierarchy, and the heavenly structure the Sumerians described like a bureaucracy Because once the story moves from cities and numbers to the machinery behind authority itself, it stops being just a timeline mystery and starts sounding like a blueprint. Part 412. Now, if there's one idea that keeps echoing through everything we've covered so far, it's this: the Sumerians didn't think civilization was something humans slowly built from scratch. They thought it was something humans received, maintained, and tried not to lose. That's why the phrase kingship descended from heaven isn't just a poetic hook, it's a worldview. In the King List, it shows up before any king's name, before any reign length, before any city is introduced, like the writer is telling you. If you don't understand this, you won't understand anything that follows. The text isn't saying humans experimented with leadership until they stumbled into monarchy. It's saying the office arrived fully formed, and then humans operated inside it. And this is where modern readers tend to slip, because the instinct is to hear from heaven and immediately file it under religion metaphor or spiritual language. But in the Sumerian context, the divine realm isn't just a foggy place of abstract holiness. The divine realm behaves like a structured authority, with assignments, roles, and jurisdictions, less like a fantasy pantheon and more like a bureaucracy. Each major power governs a domain, and the system runs because those domains stay in order. That's why the gods in Sumerian thinking aren't simply characters with big personalities. They're administrators of reality. One handles fresh water and hidden knowledge, another handles solar justice, another handles thresholds and purity, another handles harvest cycles, another handles celestial timing. And when that's the framework, kingship becomes one more domain, an official function that connects the human world to the cosmic one. This is also why it's so important that the King List treats kingship as an institution, not an achievement. The office is what matters. The individual is just the person sitting in the chair until the chair moves to another city or another name replaces theirs in the record. That's the opposite of how most people imagine early kings, where power is personal, violent, and constantly contested. The Sumerian model is more like the system exists first, and people step into roles inside the system. Even the language points in that direction. The term for kingship, nam lugal, carries the sense of something decreed, something assigned as a fate or a fixed nature, rather than something improvised by humans. The king isn't simply the strongest guy with weapons. The king is the designated owner of an office that has cosmic backing, which means the king's job isn't only to command armies or collect tribute. The king's job is to keep the world aligned. Now bring back the concept of me, because this is where it starts to connect to everything else: temples, calendars, laws, measurement, even the idea of civilization itself. If me are the packaged norms that make complex society possible, then kingship is only one piece of a full kit. Writing can be a me. Craftsmanship can be a me. Ritual timing can be a me. Law and justice can be a me. And the point isn't that humans invented these things. The point is that these things were delivered into the human sphere, and humans were expected to keep them intact. That idea helps explain the obsessive precision you see in later Mesopotamian culture. Temple construction isn't treated like creative architecture, where you just build whatever looks good. It's treated like alignment work. Measurements matter, orientation matters, repetition matters. It's as if the temple isn't just a building, it's an interface. And the same goes for calendars and ritual schedules. The timing isn't casual. It's anchored to celestial events, cycles of the sun, and predictable patterns that connect human life to something larger. That's not how people behave when they think they're inventing a system for the first time. That's how people behave when they believe they're maintaining a system that already exists and can be damaged if handled incorrectly. This is also why law in Mesopotamian tradition often feels less like legislation and more like record keeping. Law is presented as something revealed, something that originates beyond human debate, something that kings and scribes preserve rather than create. In that framework, justice isn't whatever the king decides today. Justice is a cosmic principle, like sunlight, meant to be impartial, consistent, and rooted in an external order. So put all that together, and the world before the flood starts to look less like a mythic fairy tale and more like a stable operating environment. A planet with predictable cycles, a landscape that supports continuity, a network of cities that aren't just economic hubs, but symbolic nodes. And an institution of kingship that isn't a rough human invention, but an installed office that comes with a job description: preserve the order. Now here's the part that gets even more intense. The King List doesn't merely say kingship came from heaven as a general idea, it says kingship descended, and then it was in Eridu. That's a movement from above to below, and then a specific landing point. Not kingship became popular among the people, not kingship developed in the region, but kingship was in this city. And Eridu, according to both tradition and archaeology, behaves exactly like a designated starting point. The site shows continuity of sacred rebuilding in the same footprint across long spans of time, as if moving the sacred center was unthinkable. That kind of persistence is hard to explain as mere convenience. It reads like responsibility, like the location isn't chosen because it's useful. It's chosen because it's assigned. If the King List is preserving memory rather than pure invention, then what it's really describing is not just old kings with big numbers. It's describing an entire governance model where authority is delivered into a mapped world, installed into designated seats, and tied to a network of functions that connect the human realm to the cosmic one. That's why the reign lengths matter less than the structure. The structure says, before the flood, there was an order. And the flood didn't simply kill people, it broke continuity. Because look at what happens after. The King List keeps going, but the scale shrinks. Reigns become shorter dynasties, turn over faster cities, rise and fall in timeframes that feel more like the messy human world we recognize. It's as if the system survives, but the conditions that supported the old version of it are gone. Inheritance continues, but with gaps, distortions, and patchwork repairs. And that brings us back to the biggest pressure point in the whole story. What is heaven in this context? If the divine realm is a bureaucracy of functions, if me are civilizational modules, if kingship is an installed office, then heaven starts sounding less like a cloud paradise and more like a source and origin point of authority and knowledge that the Sumerians treated as real. Some people will insist it must be metaphor because the alternative is too uncomfortable. Others will say the text is describing non-human agents because the language is strangely literal for something that's supposed to be purely symbolic. But either way, the King List forces the same uncomfortable admission. The earliest written civilization on Earth preserved a memory of authority that did not begin with humans negotiating leadership. It begins with something being delivered. And once that idea is on the table, the next question becomes unavoidable. If part 1 and part 2 were about the numbers, the cities, and the timeline, then now the story has to move toward the source of the system itself. What is the assembly behind kingship? What is the structure that assigns domains? And why do later texts keep describing the divine realm like an administrative hierarchy rather than a loose collection of myths? So let's zoom in on this assembly idea, because once you see how the Sumerian worldview is structured, the king list stops sounding like a random myth and starts sounding like the front page of a much bigger administrative framework. The divine realm in these traditions doesn't behave like a loose collection of stories. It behaves like a hierarchy with roles, jurisdictions, and responsibility. And if that's true, then kingship descended from heaven isn't just a religious slogan. It's the claim that political authority is a delegated function from an external source. Here's the simplest way to put it. In the Sumerian model, authority doesn't bubble up from people organizing themselves. Authority flows down from a higher structure, and humans are expected to align with it. That's why so many things, law, temple design, ritual timing, feel less like invention and more like compliance with a blueprint. And this is where the word heaven starts to become tricky. Because for modern audiences, heaven instantly triggers an image, clouds, angels, spiritual metaphor, an afterlife. But in this older framework, heaven reads more like a place of authority and origin, where assignments come from, where decisions are made, where the rules exist before humans ever touch them. Not heaven as a reward, but heaven as headquarters. That's why the way the Sumerians describe divinity is so different from what people expect. The gods aren't just personalities, they're domains. And those domains aren't optional. They're the categories that reality runs on. Wisdom and creation, transformation and craft justice and timekeeping. These aren't just poetic themes. They're functions assigned to specific centers and maintained through institutions. Think about the cities again. Eridu is associated with wisdom and creation, and later tradition places Enki there as the god of freshwater craftsmanship and secret knowledge. Sippar is tied to solar order and justice, later associated with Shamash. And Shuruppak becomes the threshold city, the place that sits right at the edge of the flood transition. Whether someone reads those associations as literal or symbolic, the pattern is still the same. The geography itself is being used like a circuit board. Now, if a system like that exists, the next logical question is who enforces it? Who assigns domains? Who decides that kingship belongs here? Wisdom belongs there, justice belongs there, transition belongs there. This is where the idea of the Anunnaki becomes impossible to ignore, because in the wider Sumerian tradition, they appear as a class of beings linked to the heaven-to-earth movement, involved in judgment, administration, and the management of order. Again, forget the modern pop culture version for a second. What matters here is the role they play in the logic of the system. They're not described like distant abstractions. They're described like participants. And that circles back to the King List's biggest provocation. It doesn't say humans invented kingship. It says kingship descended and then kingship was in Eridu. A descent followed by a placement. Almost like something was transferred from one level of reality to another, then anchored to a specific location. If that's even remotely close to the memory being preserved, then the early kings aren't just rulers, they're intermediaries. They're the human-facing layer of a system whose original authority sits outside the human layer. That would explain why the list's tone is so calm about impossibly long reigns. If the scribes thought they were tracking an office that existed before normal human time scales, then recording enormous reigns isn't fantasy, it's accounting. And notice how the King List treats change. When kingship moves, it moves like an office relocation. The center shifts from one city to another, as if the seat of authority can be transferred the way a capital can be transferred, because the authority isn't personal, it's positional. That detail matters because it means the list isn't telling a story of constant conquest. It's telling a story of institutional continuity right up until the flood breaks it. So, here's a question worth sitting with. What does it mean to live inside a society where the highest value is continuity, not innovation? Where the goal isn't build something new, but keep the inherited order intact? Because in that kind of world, the king isn't supposed to be a revolutionary. The king is supposed to be a stabilizer, a keeper of me. Those civilizational norms that define how society works. This is why, when you look at later Mesopotamian culture, it can feel obsessive about repetition. The sacred footprint stays the same. The temple orientation stays the same. The ritual calendar stays the same. The legal codes present themselves as alignment with higher order, not as political experimentation. If the people maintaining these systems believed they were preserving something delivered, then improvisation would feel dangerous, like changing a component in a machine, without understanding what the machine actually does. Now bring the flood back into the picture, because this is where the story becomes almost heartbreaking. The list gives you this long era of continuity, 8 kings, 5 cities, vast reigns, then drops a single sentence. Then the flood swept over. And right after that, the scale shrinks. The reigns become shorter. The turnover accelerates. The world becomes more like the human world we recognize, messier, faster, more fragile. And if civilization began with inheritance, then the flood is the moment inheritance gets interrupted. Not just property or bloodlines, inheritance of the system itself. The continuity breaks, and what survives is fragments, cities rebuilt in diminished form rituals, preserved without full context, sacred roles remembered but partially misunderstood, and the old time scales reduced to stories because the original framework that made them sensible is gone. That would also explain something else that's easy to miss. The King List doesn't separate myth time from history time. It treats the whole thing as one continuous record, as if the scribes didn't think there was a genre boundary at all. The only real boundary is catastrophe. So, when people argue about whether the pre-flood kings were literal or symbolic, it can distract from the deeper point. The deeper point is that the text preserves a memory of a world that was stable enough, socially, institutionally, environmentally, to be imagined as continuous across vast spans, and then a single event or collapse that severed that continuity. Even if the numbers are encoding something else, the story structure is still saying before the flood, the system was whole. After the flood, it was repaired. And now we're right at the edge of the next step in the story. Because if kingship is an installed office, and if me are civilizational modules, and if the divine realm is described like an administrative hierarchy, then the next question becomes very direct. What exactly was the human role in that hierarchy? Were humans just the workforce living inside a sacred network, maintaining temples and calendars and law under a system they didn't originate? Or were humans meant to be something else? Partners, students, servants, custodians, depending on how the tradition is read. Part 6 is where we follow that thread into the idea of intermediaries, how sacred offices, temple institutions, and the king's role function as a bridge between the human world and the heavenly system. The King List insists was real. So, if the big claim is that kingship didn't rise up from human society but descended into it, then the next piece is almost unavoidable. Somebody had to run the connection between the human world and whatever heaven represented in this system. And in Mesopotamia, that connection wasn't vague. It was institutional, physical, and built into everyday life through temples' priesthood and the king's public role. In the modern imagination, temples are often treated like places people go to worship and then leave, like a spiritual side activity. But in the world suggested by the King List and the traditions surrounding these cities, the temple is more like infrastructure, an operating center where the system gets maintained. It's where timing is kept, where offerings are scheduled, where laws are confirmed, where ritual responsibilities are managed, and where the cosmic job of a city gets anchored to the ground in repeatable routines. That's why the temple building pattern matters so much. When a place like Eridu gets rebuilt on the same sacred footprint over and over, it doesn't feel like a community just rebuilding a favorite spot. It feels like people protecting a coordinate, like the location itself is part of the mechanism, and moving it would be like unplugging something. The culture doesn't believe it has the right to unplug. Now think about what that implies for the people inside the temple system. Priests in this world aren't just spiritual influencers. They're custodians of procedure. Their job is continuity, doing the same things at the correct times, in the correct sequence, with the correct measurements, so the inherited order stays stable. And that fits perfectly with the larger concept of me, because if me are civilizational norms that are received rather than invented, then priests and scribes aren't creators. They're guardians of a set of instructions. This is where scribes become unbelievably important. On the surface, scribes are just record keepers, names, dates, quantities, inventories, taxes, transactions. But under the hood, scribes are memory engineers. They're the ones who freeze continuity into clay and make sure the system survives a bad harvest, a political takeover, a generational shift, even a collapse. And when you look at the King List through that lens, it starts to feel less like a story meant to entertain and more like a document meant to preserve legitimacy. Who holds the office, where the office is seated, and how authority has moved through time. That's why the tone is so dry. If the purpose is to preserve the chain, then you don't write it like a myth. You write it like a ledger. The weird part is that the ledger includes reigns that are impossibly long, but the format tells you the scribes still believe the data belonged in the same category as everything else they tracked. Now, where does the king sit in all of this? In a system where authority is positional and descended. The king isn't just the top of society, he's the hinge. The king becomes the public interface between the human layer and the heavenly layer. The person whose legitimacy is defined by how well he embodies the office, rather than how loudly he dominates everyone around him. That helps explain why kingship in this framework is less about personal heroism and more about maintaining alignment. The king is expected to uphold law as an expression of higher order, maintain ritual obligations, protect sacred spaces, and ensure the city's assigned function stays intact. And this is where it gets really interesting, because once kingship is seen as a function, you can start to understand why the King List treats the movement of kingship between cities like a transfer of the seat rather than a conquest narrative. The list doesn't obsess over battlefield drama. It obsesses over where the office is located, as if the location matters, because it anchors the function. That's not how a text behaves if it's trying to glorify warlords. It's how a text behaves if it's documenting the continuity of an institution that's supposed to exist, regardless of the individuals inside it. Now zoom out even further and notice what kind of society this produces. If authority is descended and embedded in a temple-centered system, then the population isn't just living in a city, they're living inside a schedule. Daily life becomes synchronized to rituals, seasons, measurements, and celestial timing, because those aren't nice traditions, they're maintenance routines. The city is a machine built on repetition, offerings, festivals, legal procedures, building alignments, administrative cycles, all designed to keep order stable. That also means knowledge works differently in this world. Instead of seeing knowledge as something humans bravely invent, the tradition frames knowledge as something delivered, then preserved. Writing isn't celebrated as a human breakthrough. It's treated like a gift that allows continuity. Law isn't framed as a debate outcome. It's framed as alignment with cosmic justice. And the king, again, is the public guarantee that this alignment is being maintained at least in theory. If that sounds rigid, it is. But rigidity can also produce durability, especially if the environment supports stability, which is why the pre-flood world in the King List reads like an era of continuity rather than constant collapse. In a wetland-rich landscape with abundance and predictable cycles, you don't need to reinvent society every generation. You can keep the machine running, and the highest virtue becomes, don't break the inheritance. And then the flood hits. One sentence in the King List, and the entire mechanism, this chain of office, this sacred geography, this inheritance of me gets interrupted. Whether it was a single catastrophic event or a long environmental unraveling compressed into one remembered moment, the story treats it the same way continuity breaks. That break explains the post-flood difference better than almost anything else. After the flood kings still exist, cities still exist, and the list still tracks succession, but the scale shrinks and the turnover speeds up, as if the world can no longer support the same kind of long stability. The inheritance continues, but now it's patched, fragmented, and rebuilt from whatever survived rituals, repeated, even when full context is fading. Sacred places maintained, even when the original why is slipping into legend, and old-time scales remembered as enormous because the system they belong to no longer exists in a complete form. And that brings the story to a sharp edge. If priests and scribes and kings functioned as intermediaries, maintaining an inherited order, then the flood isn't just a disaster story. It's the moment the chain between heaven and earth becomes unclear. The system survives, but the source becomes more distant, more symbolic, more mythologized, because direct continuity has been damaged. So, the next part has to confront the most uncomfortable question head on. If the Sumerians treated the divine realm like an administrative hierarchy and treated kingship like a function that descended into a specific city, then what does that imply about the original heavenly structure, who was in it, how it operated, and why humans would build their entire civilization around preserving its assignments? When the Sumerian texts describe the divine realm, it doesn't come across like a dreamy spiritual metaphor. It comes across like administration. Not just gods in the way later religions imagine them, but a structured hierarchy where each power has a domain, a job, and a responsibility inside a larger order. And if that's the backdrop, then kingship descended from heaven stops sounding like poetry and starts sounding like a transfer of authority, like an office being issued from a higher level down to the human level. That's why the King List feels so unnerving to modern readers. It isn't trying to convince you with drama. It's calmly documenting a system. It names cities that already matter, rulers who slot into an office reign lengths that follow a structured numerical pattern, and then a single disaster line that breaks continuity. Then the flood swept over. It's not written like once upon a time. It's written like, here's how the world was organized until it wasn't. So let's put the big question on the table without dodging it. What if heaven, in this context, is less about an afterlife and more about a source, the place where authority, roles, and civilizational norms originate? Because when a culture repeatedly frames its most important systems as received rather than invented, it's telling you something about how it sees humans in the chain of command. In that model, humans aren't the authors of order. Humans are the custodians of it. And that's where the idea of a divine assembly or a structured council of authority starts to matter. If reality is governed through domains, wisdom, justice, craft, timekeeping, purity, transition, then someone has to coordinate those domains, and someone has to decide how they map onto Earth through specific cities and offices. That's what makes the geography in the King List feel like a designed network instead of a random scatter of settlements that got lucky. You're looking at a system where each node has a function, and the human institutions, temples, calendars, kingship exist to keep those functions stable. Now here's the part most people either overcomplicate or oversimplify the term Anunnaki. In the broader Sumerian tradition, the Anunnaki are framed as beings associated with the heaven to earth movement and connected to judgment and authority, not just distant divinity. Whatever interpretation someone prefers, symbolic, theological, literal, the role they occupy in the story, logic, is the same. They represent the level of reality that stands above humans in the chain of order. And that matters because the King List's opening line doesn't say humans selected a king. It says kingship descended, and then kingship was seated in Eridu, meaning authority comes first, then the human layer organizes around it. This is also where it helps to stop thinking about kingship as a person and start thinking about kingship as a channel. In the King List, kingship behaves like a stable office that moves between cities, while individual rulers come and go as temporary occupants. That's why the list can record the reign of a figure like Gilgamesh alongside the pre-flood kings without changing its tone, because it's tracking the continuity of the institution, not telling a heroic saga. The kings are listed like entries in a registry, because for the scribes, legitimacy is a matter of placement in the chain, not personality on the throne. So, what does a human society look like when it's built around the idea that order is inherited and maintained, not invented and disrupted? It looks like a world where repetition is sacred because repetition is maintenance. It looks like a world where measurement matters because measurement is alignment. It looks like a world where calendars matter because timing is the mechanism that keeps human activity synchronized with the larger structure. And it looks like a world where the king's job is to be the public face of that synchronization, an intermediary whose legitimacy depends on how well he preserves the inherited order. That gives a totally different meaning to the flood line. If the pre-flood world is defined by continuity, by an unbroken system of inherited functions, then the flood isn't just water. The flood becomes the severing of the chain. It's the moment the system that was being maintained becomes partially lost, and what survives afterward is smaller, faster, more fragile, and more human-scaled. That fits the way the King List shifts after the flood into reign lengths that suddenly look biologically plausible, while still treating the timeline as continuous history. So, instead of asking only, did anyone literally rule for 800 years, there's another question that gets sharper with every page. What kind of reality would make the scribes comfortable recording those spans in the same administrative voice they used for later kings? Because even if the numbers are encoding symbolic eras or compressed dynasties, the structure is still doing something important. It's preserving the memory of a long, stable order that ended in a catastrophe. The text is telling you that the break in the timeline isn't myth versus history. The break is before versus after the flood. And here's where the story starts to tighten around the next reveal. If kingship is an installed function, and if the temple system is the maintenance infrastructure, then heaven has to be more than a vibe. It has to be the reference point that defines what the correct order even is. Because you can't maintain an inherited blueprint unless that blueprint exists somewhere in some form, whether as tradition, as instruction, as memory, or as a literal source of authority that the culture experienced as external. That's why the Sumerian worldview keeps leaning into the same direction again and again. Humans don't author the system. Humans serve it. And the king isn't a self-made ruler. He's a role holder. When the King List says kingship descended, it's telling you the office existed prior to the occupants, and the occupants are accountable to the office. In that kind of society, the king's most dangerous temptation wouldn't be weakness, it would be improvisation. Because improvisation threatens continuity, and continuity is the sacred core of a world built on inheritance. So, with all that in mind, here are the 3 pressure points Part 7 needs you to keep in your head as we move forward. The divine realm is described like an ordered hierarchy of functions, not a chaotic mythic playground. Kingship is framed as a transferred office, installed into specific cities within a meaningful network. The flood represents a rupture in continuity, after which the system continues but in reduced form and human timescales. Once you understand that this whole worldview is built on inheritance, the flood stops being a side detail and becomes the main event. Because the flood isn't just a disaster happened. In the logic of the King List, it's the moment the chain breaks, the moment continuity is interrupted, and whatever was being maintained gets knocked out of alignment. And the scariest part is how calmly the text treats that break. One sentence, no emotion, no explanation, just, "Then the flood swept over." That line reads like the end of a world that the scribes thought was stable. Not stable in the sense of nothing ever goes wrong, but stable in the sense that the system is supposed to keep going. Kingship stays intact. Cities keep their assigned roles, temples keep their sacred footprints, and the me remain preserved as working modules of civilization. Then the flood hits, and suddenly stability isn't the default anymore. And here's what makes it even more interesting. The King List doesn't say civilization ended. It says the flood swept over, and then it continues. New kings appear, new dynasties appear. The office persists, the record-keeping persists, and the idea of legitimacy persists. So, whatever the flood was, it wasn't total extinction, it was disruption. The machine doesn't disappear, but it starts running differently. That's why the shift in reign lengths is so telling. Before the flood, the list records reigns in these enormous structured spans that feel like a different category of time. After the flood, the numbers shrink quickly into ranges that fit human lifespans and human political realities. And the text doesn't argue about it or explain it. It just treats the change as a fact, like the world itself changed, and everyone living afterward was expected to accept the new scale. So, what does it mean to rebuild after a rupture like that? It means living in a world where the system still exists, but the original conditions that supported the system are damaged or gone. And when that happens, the first thing that changes isn't necessarily the outward forms, it's the relationship to the source. Think about it. If you live in a society that believes kingship is descended, that law is aligned to cosmic justice, that temples are interfaces, and that me are inherited codes, then your whole identity is tied to continuity. When continuity breaks, the impulse isn't to invent a new worldview overnight. The impulse is to preserve what can be preserved, rebuild what can be rebuilt, and keep repeating the maintenance routines, even if the deeper context is becoming blurry. That's how a civilization becomes a museum of itself without realizing it. The rituals continue because stopping them feels dangerous. The sacred footprints remain sacred because moving them feels like breaking an agreement older than memory. The The king still sits on the throne because the office still exists, even if the office now operates in a diminished world. The scribes still write because writing is how inheritance survives when living memory starts failing. And this is the moment where myth and history stop being separate categories and start becoming stages of degradation. Not myth equals fake and history equals real, but myth equals memory that survived the rupture in a transformed form. After a collapse, people don't typically say, "We lost information, so let's admit we don't know." They build narratives that preserve meaning even when mechanics are missing. They compress long processes into single events. They personify systems into characters. They turn the source into a story because they can't access it the way the ancestors did. So the flood becomes more than water. The flood becomes the boundary line between direct continuity and inherited fragments. And that boundary line explains why the post-flood world, even if it still respects the old order, starts acting like a civilization trying to remember a blueprint it can't fully read anymore. This also explains why the King List is so obsessed with legitimacy. In a rebuilt world, legitimacy becomes fragile because the closer you are to the rupture, the more people argue about who has the right to hold the office. When the system is whole, the office is just the office. When the system is damaged, the office becomes a battlefield because whoever controls it can claim to represent the original order. And this is where the list's format matters again. It doesn't present itself as entertainment. It presents itself as continuity, a chain, a line of succession that says this is how authority moved, and this is why the current order is legitimate. In other words, it's not only remembering the past, it's stabilizing the present. Now bring the environment back in for a second. If the earlier landscape was more stable, more wetland rich, more predictable, then a long continuity makes psychological and institutional sense. But after major environmental change, stability gets harder. Resource zones shift, coastlines change river systems, alter course. And what used to be a predictable rhythm becomes a more stressful, more competitive reality. When the ground under your civilization changes, political turnover speeds up because the system has to keep reacting. That's why the post-flood section feels more like the world humans recognize shorter reigns, more turnover, more dynasties, more friction. It's not necessarily that people became worse. It's that the conditions changed and the system that used to be maintained through continuity is now being forced into adaptation. And here's the part that quietly changes everything. Even after the rupture, the culture keeps treating authority as descended. The idea doesn't vanish. The temple doesn't become optional. The king doesn't become just a politician. The laws don't become whatever we vote on this year. The entire worldview keeps insisting that order is external higher and inherited because that belief is the glue that holds society together after the chain breaks. So instead of the flood wiping away the worldview, the flood may have intensified it. When people survive a rupture, they cling harder to whatever feels like continuity. They preserve the forms with more urgency. They copy the lists more carefully. They rebuild temples more stubbornly. They repeat rituals more rigidly. And that rigidity can produce something that looks like a contradiction. On one hand, the civilization is adapting to a harsher, faster world. On the other hand, the civilization is trying to behave as if the old blueprint still applies perfectly. That's the tension of a rebuild living in the post-flood world while trying to preserve a pre-flood inheritance. This is also where names like the Anunnaki take on a different flavor. In a world of direct continuity, the divine hierarchy can be treated like administration roles, domains, jurisdictions. In a world after rupture, that same hierarchy starts to drift into mythic distance. The functions remain, but the relationship to the source becomes less immediate. And as the source becomes more distant, stories grow larger, because stories are what fill the gap when direct access is gone. So when modern readers look at these traditions and say, "This is myth," what they might really be seeing is the afterimage of a broken continuity. The surviving outline of a system that people kept trying to maintain, even as the world that made it stable disappeared. And that leads straight into the next part, because there's a final piece that ties all of this together. If kingship is a descended office, and temples are maintenance centers, and the post-flood world is a rebuild from fragments, then the most important question becomes not did it happen exactly like this, but what was the original system that people were trying so hard to preserve? What did the pre-flood order look like when it was whole? And what would it mean if the King List is preserving the memory of a governance model that humans didn't design but inherited? So let's do the thing everyone wants to do at this point. Try to picture the pre-flood order as if it were whole, not through modern assumptions about primitive villages slowly leveling up into cities, but through the logic the King List itself insists on inheritance. First invention, second. Because if this text is preserving memory, then before the flood isn't a blurry fairy tale era. It's an era of structured cities, structured authority, and structured continuity. Start with what the list gives you right away. Kingship doesn't emerge, it descends. That single framing choice changes everything, because it means the system doesn't begin from human negotiation. It begins from installation. And once kingship is treated like an installed office, the rest of the world starts to look like it was built to support that office. Cities with assigned roles, temples that function like anchored points, and institutions designed around preservation rather than experimentation. In a normal origin story, you'd expect chaos at the beginning, people improvising politics, forming through conflict settlements, shifting until something finally stabilizes. But the King List doesn't describe a chaotic beginning. It describes a stable continuity that lasts across incomprehensible spans, broken only by catastrophe. That's why the flood sentence hits so hard. It's not interrupting a messy process. It's interrupting a system that's presented as already running. So what does a running system look like in this worldview? It looks like a mapped Earth. An Earth where certain locations are not just convenient but meaningful. It looks like cities that aren't simply population clusters but nodes in a network, each tied to a cosmic function. Eridu isn't just the first city, it's the first seat wisdom and creation anchored to a place. Sipar isn't just another settlement, it's justice and timekeeping anchored to a place. Shuruppak isn't just a city on the list, it's a threshold point, a boundary marker where the narrative pivots into collapse. If that sounds like symbolism, it is, but it's symbolism that behaves like engineering. Because the symbolism isn't floating in the air, it's assigned to geography. And once a culture locks meaning into geography like that, cities stop being movable. They become coordinates. A city isn't just where people live, it's where a function is anchored. That's where the temple pattern makes so much sense. Rebuilding on the same sacred footprint isn't just nostalgia, it's continuity maintenance. It's people saying, this point matters, and we are responsible for keeping it active. And that responsibility fits perfectly with the broader idea of civilizational norms that are received and preserved. If the system is inherited, then the temple isn't a creative project. It's a station that must remain aligned. Now think about how power works in that kind of world. If the king is an intermediary, an office holder, whose legitimacy comes from alignment with higher order, then politics changes shape. The king is less of a self-made strongman and more of a public guarantee that the system is still connected. The king's authority isn't supposed to be personal, it's supposed to be positional. That's exactly how the King List reads. Kingship moves, seats, shift names, fill the role, but the office remains the constant. And that's also why the list's tone is so blunt. A society trying to preserve institutional continuity doesn't tell the story like an epic. It records it like a chain of custody. Who held the office, where the office was seated, and how long the office remained under that occupant. The pre-flood reigns may look impossible to modern readers, but within the internal logic of the document, they function like a record of stability, an era where the office didn't fracture every generation. This is where people usually jump straight to the numbers again, because the numbers are the loudest thing on the page. But the deeper message isn't these kings lived forever. The deeper message is this system endured. Whether the long reigns represent literal beings, symbolic eras, or compressed dynastic sequences, they all point toward the same underlying claim continuity. Before the flood was on a scale the post-flood world couldn't replicate. So, what holds that kind of continuity together? Institutions. And in Mesopotamia, the institution that ties everything together is the temple scribe king complex. Temples as maintenance centers, scribes as memory engineers, kings as role holders who stand at the interface between the human layer and the higher order the culture believes exists. That's how a system survives time, by turning continuity into routine, and routine into sacred obligation. Now bring the environment back in, because continuity isn't just a political choice, it's also a planetary condition. The earlier landscape described in the script, wetlands abundance, slow predictable patterns supports a very different kind of society than an arid, unstable world. In a stable environment, the highest skill is preservation. In a volatile environment, the highest skill becomes adaptation. And that lines up with what the King List implies through its post-flood shift. After the rupture reign lengths shrink, turnover accelerates, and the world starts acting more like the messy timeline we recognize. So the pre-flood order, as a complete system, may have felt less like early civilization and more like stewardship. Humans living inside a framework they didn't claim to invent, maintaining sacred centers, repeating alignment rituals, tracking cycles, enforcing law as cosmic justice, and keeping the institution of kingship intact, because kingship is part of the inherited package. And then the flood. Here's the most important point. The flood doesn't just destroy buildings. In this storyline, the flood breaks inheritance. It severs the clean transfer of me. It interrupts the unbroken chain of office. It forces rebuild instead of maintenance. And once you're in rebuild mode, you can preserve forms without preserving full understanding. That's where myth starts to appear, not as deception, but as survival packaging. People keep the names. People keep the cities. People keep the idea that authority is descended. People keep the temple routines. But with continuity damaged, the relationship to the source changes. What used to be administration becomes legend. What used to be direct alignment becomes ritual repetition. What used to be a blueprint becomes a story about where the blueprint came from. And that's why the King List is so fascinating. It's not trying to separate the past into neat, modern categories like myth over here, history over there. It's preserving a single continuous chain with only one true dividing line, the catastrophe that changed the world. 8 kings, 5 cities, then the flood, then the world, we can verify more easily. So, as we move into the next part, the question gets sharper and harder to avoid. If the post-flood world is a rebuild, then what exactly survived the rebuild and what got lost? And how can a civilization preserve an institution kingship while the original context for that institution becomes distant enough that later generations can only describe it as descended from heaven? So let's get specific about what survived after the flood, because the King List doesn't treat the catastrophe like a full stop. It treats it like a rupture and then a continuation. Authority keeps moving, dynasties keep forming cities, keep rising, and scribes keep recording, as if the civilization is trying to stitch a torn fabric back together using whatever thread is still intact. The first thing that survives is the idea of kingship itself. The office doesn't disappear even when the world that supposedly supported those vast pre-flood time scales is gone. That matters because it suggests kingship isn't just a political habit, it's treated like a necessary component of order, something that must persist even when everything else is unstable. In other words, the institution becomes the lifeboat. It's the thing people cling to when the environment, the geography, and maybe even the social structure have all shifted. The second thing that survives is the administrative mindset. The King List doesn't read like a traumatized myth. It reads like record keeping that refuses to blink. Even the flood is written like a line item, and then the text goes right back to what it does best, tracking succession locations and reign lengths. That kind of continuity suggests the scribal class is one of the strongest survival mechanisms in the entire story, because when the old world breaks, writing becomes the replacement for living memory. But what also survives is something subtler, the sacred map. Even in a diminished post-flood world, cities still carry roles, temples still matter, and locations still feel assigned, as if geography isn't just land, but a symbolic layout that people are obligated to maintain. That's why those rebuilding patterns hit so hard, especially at places like Eridu, where continuity is expressed physically through repeated construction on the same sacred footprint. It's like the civilization is saying we can rebuild walls, we can rebuild houses, but we can't afford to lose the coordinate. Now here's where the loss becomes visible. The post-flood world is still trying to run the old system, but it's doing it with less time, less stability, and possibly less understanding of the original source. That's why reign lengths shrink into human-scale numbers, and political turnover accelerates. If the pre-flood section represents a long continuity, however those numbers should be interpreted, then the post-flood section represents a world where continuity is harder to maintain. It's not just that leaders live shorter lives, it's that the system itself is under more pressure. And pressure changes behavior. In a stable environment, a society can prioritize preservation, repetition, and careful alignment. In an unstable environment, the same society starts reacting faster. More consolidation, more competition, more succession, more fragmentation, more rebuilding. The King List still records the office, but the rhythm of the office speeds up, like the timeline is suddenly forced into a narrower channel. This is also where myth begins to function like a storage format. When a civilization loses direct continuity, it doesn't usually throw away its inherited framework. It compresses it. It preserves the names, the roles, the sacred associations, and the foundational claim that authority is descended while the original context fades into distance. And once that happens, the old system doesn't vanish. It becomes sacred tradition, because sacred tradition is how a society protects information it can no longer fully explain. That explains why the King List refuses to separate myth time and history time. To a modern reader, the break feels like genre, impossible reigns, than plausible reigns. But to the scribes preserving this, the break is catastrophe, not storytelling style. The entire timeline is treated as one chain, and the only real dividing line is the flood. Now here's the uncomfortable part. The King List doesn't just preserve a story of survival, it preserves a claim of legitimacy. If the post-flood world is rebuilding, then whoever holds kingship afterward gains an incredible advantage by saying, "This office didn't start with us, and it doesn't belong to us. It belongs to the original order." In a fragmented world, being able to link present authority to a pre-flood continuity is basically the strongest legitimacy tool imaginable. And the King List functions like proof of lineage, not just who ruled, but why the current order deserves obedience. That's why the document is so methodical about where kingship is seated. It isn't just telling you that rulers existed, it's telling you the office had a location, a seat, a proper place in the network. And when the seat shifts, it shifts like a transfer of the institution, not like a random shuffle. That kind of detail implies that kingship is treated as an external function that must be anchored somewhere even after the flood has changed the world. And this is where the role of the temple becomes even more important post-flood. If the king is the public interface, the temple becomes the maintenance hub, and the scribes become the memory system, then a rebuild civilization would double down on those three things. Temples preserve sacred procedure, scribes preserve records, and kingship preserves the visible structure of authority. Even if the old system is no longer fully accessible, the institutions continue because they're the only bridge left. This also gives a new meaning to that opening line about descent from heaven. If the pre-flood world had a more direct relationship to the source of authority, however that should be interpreted, then after the flood, the relationship becomes less direct and more ceremonial. And when the relationship becomes ceremonial, the language becomes stronger, not weaker, because the claim has to carry more weight when the original mechanism is no longer visible. It's like the less you can verify directly, the more you insist on the principle. It descended, it was assigned, it is inherited. So what got lost? Maybe not the idea of order, but the original clarity of order. The post-flood world keeps the outlines, sacred cities, offices, rituals, records. But the deeper why, the original system logic starts to drift, turning administration into theology, turning a blueprint into tradition, turning a remembered hierarchy into a mythic distance. And that's exactly the kind of transition you'd expect when a civilization preserves continuity through institutions while the underlying conditions that made the system stable have been damaged. And notice what the text forces you to admit, even if you disagree with every speculative angle. The King List is not written like people inventing a past. It's written like people trying to preserve a chain across a break. It reads like a civilization, insisting that its authority structure didn't originate with ordinary human politics, and that the real story of the beginning is actually a story of rebuilding after a collapse. So, part 11 is where the focus tightens around the biggest implication of all. If civilization begins with inheritance and the flood is the rupture, then the real mystery isn't just whether the pre-flood reign lengths are literal. The real mystery is what kind of system could be remembered as descended mapped onto cities maintained through temples and preserved through scribal record-keeping with such stubborn continuity. Because once a culture organizes itself around maintaining an inherited order, it doesn't just preserve history, it preserves a claim about what humans are in relation to authority. At this point, the debate about whether the pre-flood reign lengths are literal can start to feel like a trap. Because if everyone gets stuck arguing about the numbers, it becomes easy to miss what the King List is actually doing. It's preserving a model of reality, not just a timeline. And that model is built around one stubborn claim: civilization is inherited. So instead of asking only, did anyone really rule for 2,800 years, shift the question slightly. What kind of system would make a civilization record its origins this way? What kind of worldview makes kingship an office that arrives, gets seated in a designated city, and then moves like an institution from capital to capital? What kind of society treats the divine realm like a hierarchy of functions and treats human institutions as maintenance mechanisms for those functions? Because once you see it, the pattern becomes hard to unsee. The cities in the list aren't presented like accidental winners in the survival game of early settlement. They read like nodes with assignments: wisdom and creation here, transformation, and craft there, justice and timekeeping, their transition at the edge. And the fact that later generations rebuild temples on the same sacred footprints, holding the same orientation across long spans of time, fits perfectly with the idea that these locations aren't just convenient, they're anchored. This is where the story stops being only about ancient kings and starts being about the human role inside an inherited structure. In a modern mindset, people assume the job of a civilization is to innovate, to push forward, to constantly reinvent. But the worldview implied here is the opposite. The job is to preserve, to maintain, to keep alignment, and to avoid breaking the inheritance. The greatest fear isn't that society will fail to invent something new. The fear is that society will lose what it was given. That's why temples don't function like optional spiritual spaces in this system. They function like operational centers where routines are performed, time is tracked, and the city's role is kept active. The priesthood and scribal culture aren't just religious add-ons. They're continuity infrastructure people whose main purpose is to keep procedures consistent enough that the inherited order survives generation after generation. And then you get the king less a self-made leader and more a role holder. In this model, kingship is not primarily a personal achievement because the office exists before the person. The king's legitimacy comes from alignment with the office and with the larger structure the office represents, which is exactly why the King List feels so cold and administrative. It's tracking the office through time, not telling a hero story. Now bring the flood back in, because here's the twist that makes the whole thing feel almost tragically human. If civilization starts with inheritance, then the flood is the moment inheritance gets interrupted. It's the rupture that forces humans to shift from maintenance mode to rebuild mode. And rebuild mode changes everything. When people rebuild from fragments, they don't just lose buildings, they lose context. They keep the forms because forms are what survive. They keep the rituals because rituals are repeatable. They keep the offices because offices stabilize society. They keep the sacred map because the sacred map tells them where meaning lives. But over time, if the original system can't be accessed the way it once was, the relationship to the source changes. That's where descended from heaven starts to function like a bridge phrase. It's a way of saying this did not originate with us, even when the original mechanism is no longer visible. It's a way of protecting legitimacy when direct continuity has been damaged. And that's why the belief might harden after a catastrophe instead of fading, because the more fragile the world becomes, the more valuable continuity feels. This also explains why the King List doesn't slice itself into modern categories like myth versus history. Modern readers look at it and see two worlds, impossible reigns, then plausible reigns. But the scribes didn't mark it as two genres. They marked it as one chain with one break. The flood isn't a storytelling transition. It's the dividing line between a world of long continuity and a world of faster turnover. So what's the real implication here? The implication is that the earliest written civilization on Earth preserved a memory not necessarily of magic, but of an order they believed preceded them. An order that assigned functions to places, roles to institutions, and legitimacy to an office rather than a personality. Whether someone interprets that as theology symbolism or something more literal, the structure of the tradition is still pointing to the same idea: humans are not the ultimate authors of the system. And that brings us to the hardest question, the one the story has been orbiting this whole time. If the pre-flood world is remembered as a stable order, with kingship operating across vast spans, and if the post-flood world is a rebuild, where the office continues, but timescales shrink, then what exactly happened at the rupture? Not just water rose, but what was lost, what connection broke, what continuity ended, what access changed. Because in a rebuild, there are two kinds of survival. There's survival of the body, people living through the disaster, and there's survival of the system, institutions, roles, procedures, and the memory of how the world is supposed to work. The King List reads like a document obsessed with the second kind of survival. It's basically saying, even if everything collapses, kingship still matters. Even if the world changes, the chain must be preserved. Even if the old order becomes distant, legitimacy is still anchored to it. That's why the list keeps going. That's why it names later rulers we can verify in the same voice used for the pre-flood kings. It's insisting continuity even when continuity has been wounded. And there's one more layer to this. A list like this doesn't only record history, it creates it. When a civilization writes down a chain of authority, it isn't just describing legitimacy, it's reinforcing legitimacy. It tells everyone living afterward, this is the order. This is where authority comes from. This is the line you belong to. In a post-rupture world, that kind of narrative isn't optional. It's stabilizing force. So, going into the final part, keep the framing tight. The mystery isn't only the numbers. The mystery is the model. A model where cities are functional nodes, where temples are maintenance centers, where scribes preserve continuity, like engineers of memory, where kings are intermediaries holding a descended office, and where a catastrophe breaks the chain, forcing humanity to rebuild a world from inherited fragments. Here's the final idea to sit with: what if the dawn of civilization isn't the start of the story at all, but the restart? What if the first cities we can clearly document weren't humanity's first attempt at organized life, but the earliest phase we can see after a rupture erased what came before? The Sumerian King List doesn't describe a world slowly climbing out of chaos. It describes a world that already had order, already had sacred centers, already had kingship, and then lost it. That's why the King List is so hard to file away as harmless myth. It reads like a record of continuity, and even the impossible parts are written in the same administrative voice as the parts that later match archaeology and confirmed rulers. It doesn't give you a neat genre shift from legend to history, because to the people preserving it, the only real shift is catastrophe. 8 rulers, immense reigns, sacred cities. Then one sentence. Then the flood swept over, and the system continues in a reduced human-scaled form. So, instead of asking, were the reign lengths literal, the more revealing question becomes, what kind of event makes a culture remember the past as larger than normal time? Because even if those reigns encode symbolic eras or compressed dynasties, the underlying message is still that the pre-flood order was stable in a way the post-flood world could not match. In the script you've just heard, that stability is tied to two things working together: a world that supported continuity and institutions designed to preserve it. On the environmental side, the idea is straightforward. A wetter, more abundant landscape supports longer-term stability, while a harsher, shifting landscape forces faster adaptation. On the institutional side, the mechanism is even clearer. Temples function as maintenance centers, scribes preserve memory as written continuity, and kingship operates as a positional office that anchors legitimacy to an inherited order. That trio temple scribe king doesn't just build a society, it preserves a society across time, especially when living memory starts to fracture. And once a catastrophe hits, that same trio becomes survival infrastructure. The king stabilizes authority, the temple stabilizes procedure, and the scribe stabilizes identity by fixing continuity into record. After a rupture, people can lose tools, lose roads, lose buildings, even lose whole cities. But if they keep the chain of legitimacy and the routine of alignment, they can still feel like they're living inside a meaningful order instead of random chaos. That's how a civilization continues, even when the world that originally shaped it is gone. This is where myth starts to look less like fabrication and more like preservation under pressure. When a system is whole, it can be run like administration. When a system is damaged, it gets carried forward as ritual, tradition, and story. Because story is what survives when direct access is lost. That's why the King List can carry the memory of impossible reigns and still land in a section that contains historically verifiable kings like Gilgamesh without blinking. It's not performing for modern skeptics. It's protecting continuity the only way it knows how, by treating the chain as unbroken, except for the one rupture that mattered. Now circle back one last time to the most loaded phrase in the entire document, "Kingship descended from heaven." Whether someone reads that spiritually, symbolically, or literally, the function of the phrase is the same. It locates authority outside ordinary human invention. It frames kingship as received rather than created, and it sets the tone for everything else. Cities as assigned nodes, temples as alignment points, law as cosmic justice, and social order as something humans maintain rather than design from scratch. And that's exactly why the pre-flood era is described as if it belongs to a different scale of time. If the order is inherited, then the pre-flood world represents the era when inheritance was intact, when the blueprint was readable, when continuity was normal, and when the system could be imagined as running smoothly for spans the post-flood world can't replicate. Then the flood arrives as a clean dividing line, and suddenly the reins shrink, the turnover accelerates, and the timeline starts behaving like the compressed, fragile human history we recognize. So, what's the takeaway without turning this into a forced conclusion? The Sumerian King List, preserved across multiple copies and treated as a reference record, refuses to cooperate with the idea that civilization began neatly where textbooks place it. It suggests that the earliest phase we call history may actually be the aftermath of a collapsed humanity, restarting with fragments rebuilding sacred centers, preserving the office of kingship, and carrying forward a memory that authority and civilizational order were once part of something larger. If that's true, then the flood is more than a story about water. It's the moment the human relationship to the source changes. Before the rupture order is maintained, after the rupture order is reconstructed. Before the rupture, the system is whole enough to feel like administration. After the rupture, it survives as institution tradition and mythic memory. And the King List becomes in a way the civilization's insistence that the chain still matters, even if the world has become smaller. And maybe that's the real reason this document still bothers people a century after it was translated, because it doesn't just challenge a date on a timeline, it challenges the direction of the story. It suggests the possibility that humanity didn't begin by inventing order, but by inheriting it, losing it, and then rebuilding with whatever remained. So here's the question to leave hanging, exactly the way the King List leaves things hanging. If the first kings were recorded as part of a continuous chain, and if the flood marks the rupture, then what else in our origin story is actually a reconstruction story? And what other artifacts, quiet, administrative, easy to overlook, might be preserving memories of a world we've mislabeled as myth simply because we don't know where to place it? If you made it to the end, drop a comment with the one detail from this story that stuck with you the most. And if you want more long-form deep dives that challenge conventional timelines and follow the evidence wherever it leads, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.